It was meant to be a love story. George Boldt, a man of immense wealth and ambition, spent over 5 years building an elaborate castle on a tiny island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. Every brick, every stone, every painstaking detail was meant for one purpose: to give his beloved wife Louise the home of her dreams. But in January 1904, just days before the castle's completion, Louise died suddenly of heart failure. Boldt, broken and inconsolable, stopped all work on the mansion, leaving it a haunting monument to love lost too soon. What drives a man to abandon his dream? George Boldt arrived in America with nothing. Born in Prussia in 1851, he carried only ambition and an instinct for hospitality. At 13, he worked as a kitchen boy. By 25, he managed hotels. He understood something fundamental about wealth in the Gilded Age. Rich men didn't just want luxury, they wanted to feel understood. Boldt gave them that. In 1893, he took control of the Waldorf Hotel in New York City. Within months, it became the most fashionable address in Manhattan. John Jacob Astor himself entrusted Boldt with his most ambitious project, merging the Waldorf with the Astoria to create the largest, most opulent hotel in the world. The Waldorf Astoria wasn't just a building, it was theatre, and George Boldt was its master. He remembered guests' names, their preferences, their secrets. Millionaires felt seen. Politicians felt powerful. Society women felt beautiful. Boldt orchestrated every detail with precision that bordered on obsession. But behind the impeccable service lived a private man, a man shaped not by business, but by love. Louise Carey entered George's life when both were young and striving. She was the daughter of a Philadelphia merchant, educated, graceful, ambitious in her own right. They married in 1877 when George was still building his reputation and Louise was his closest advisor. Their partnership was extraordinary. While George managed the public face of their empire, Louise managed everything else. She reviewed menus, she trained staff, she transformed hotels from lodging into experiences. Guests at Boldt properties didn't just rent rooms, they entered a world Louise had carefully designed. She possessed an artist's eye and a strategist's mind. Together they built wealth that seemed impossible for immigrants. By 1900, George Boldt was worth millions. He moved among Vanderbilts and Rockefellers as an equal, yet wealth never changed what mattered most to him. Louise remained his centre. Their children, Clover and George Jr., grew up watching a marriage that defied the transactional nature of Gilded Age unions. George and Louise genuinely delighted in each other. They finished each other's sentences. They laughed at private jokes. They built something rare among their social circle, authentic partnership. Every summer, the Boldts escaped New York's suffocating heat for the Thousand Islands region along the St. Lawrence River. The area had become a playground for America's elite, a chain of nearly 2,000 islands where industrial fortunes built summer retreats. In 1895, George purchased Hart Island. The island was small, just 5 acres of rocky land covered in scrub brush and pine. But George saw something else. He saw possibility. He saw a place where he could give Louise something no amount of hotel revenue could buy. He saw a kingdom built for a queen. Louise had always loved European castles. During their travels, she collected photographs and sketches of Rhineland fortresses and Scottish manor houses. She dreamed in turrets and stone. George decided to make those dreams real. He renamed the island Hart Island. The shape was almost perfect, a natural valentine in the river, and on that heart George would build a castle. Not a replica, not an imitation. The real thing. He hired the finest architects, Philadelphia's G.W. and W.D. Hewitt, who had designed mansions for the Vanderbilts. He imported craftsmen from Europe, stonemasons who understood medieval techniques, woodcarvers trained in Renaissance guilds, artists who could recreate the grandeur Louise admired. Construction began in 1900. George poured his fortune into the project. The initial budget was $2.5 million, equivalent to roughly $80 million today. But budgets were merely suggestions. If Louise wanted hand-carved Italian marble, George bought the quarry. If she admired Bavarian woodwork, George hired masters from Bavaria. The castle rose from bedrock with astonishing ambition. It would contain 120 rooms spread across 6 floors. Towers soared toward the sky, a tribute to medieval keeps. Stone walls 3 feet thick in places promised permanence. Every window was custom made, every doorframe hand carved, every detail obsessed over. George wasn't building a summer home, he was building immortality. The ground floor would feature a grand ballroom where Louise could host gatherings to rival any European palace. The dining room would seat 30 beneath hand-painted ceilings. The library would house thousands of volumes in custom shelving. Even the basement held surprises: an indoor pool, a bowling alley, tunnels connecting service areas. The upper floors contained private quarters designed for Louise's comfort. Her bedroom faced east to catch morning light. Her sitting room opened onto a balcony overlooking the river. Her bathroom featured tile work imported from Italy and fixtures cast in bronze. George commissioned a separate powerhouse on an adjacent island. It would generate electricity for the castle, a rare luxury in 1900. The machinery alone cost a fortune, but George wanted Louise to have every modern convenience hidden behind medieval facades. He built a yacht house elaborate enough to be a mansion itself. Inside, the family's vessels rested in arched bays, while guest rooms filled the upper floors. Even service buildings received architectural attention. The gardener's cottage looked like a small castle. The hennery resembled a stone chapel. Nothing was too small for perfection. Landscape architects transformed the island's rocky soil into terraced gardens. Thousands of tons of earth were barged in. Rare plants were imported from around the world. Stone pathways wound through carefully planned vistas. Louise would have Italian gardens and English lawns, rose arbours and reflecting pools. George spent hours with designers, reviewing every blueprint. He walked the construction site daily when in residence, checking progress. His instructions were absolute. This must be perfect. Louise deserved perfection. Workers marvelled at his dedication. Some called it love, others called it madness. Perhaps it was both. By 1903, the castle neared completion. The stone walls stood complete. The towers reached their full height. Interior craftsmen installed woodwork and plaster. Artists painted murals. The dream was taking solid form. George planned a grand unveiling for Valentine's Day 1904. He would present Louise with the finished castle, a kingdom built by love. She would walk through rooms designed around her tastes. She would stand on balconies overlooking water that reflected her happiness. She would finally have the fairy tale home she'd sketched in her imagination. The workers hurried to meet the deadline. Stone dust filled the air. Hammers rang across the island. Every day brought the dream closer. But beneath the excitement, something else grew. Louise had been unwell. Nothing dramatic, just fatigue, shortness of breath, moments where colour drained from her face. George noticed. Of course he noticed. But Louise insisted she was fine. The castle energised her. She reviewed fabric samples and approved paint colours with her usual enthusiasm. George chose to believe her. The castle was nearly finished. Just weeks remained. The furniture waited in warehouses. The gardens needed only spring to bloom. Everything was ready for Louise to finally claim her kingdom. What could possibly go wrong? The scale of George Boldt's vision defied reasonable ambition. To understand what he built, you must first understand what it required. Castle construction in 1900 wasn't a matter of hiring a contractor and waiting. It was orchestrating an invasion of labour, material and skill across hostile terrain. Hart Island had no infrastructure, no roads, no docks large enough for supply barges, no housing for workers, no storage for materials. George built all of it first. He constructed a small village on the island to house craftsmen. Dozens of workers lived on site during construction seasons. Masons, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, labourers. They needed shelter, food, fresh water. George created a self-sufficient community. Supply barges arrived constantly during building months. Each load required careful coordination. Stone blocks from Massachusetts, timber from Vermont, marble from Italy, tile from Spain, fixtures from England, glass from France. Everything came by water. The St. Lawrence complicated logistics immensely. Ice locked the river from December through March. Construction halted completely during winter months. George's deadline pressure intensified each fall as weather forced work to stop. Spring thaws brought renewed frenzy. The castle's foundation alone consumed months of effort. Bedrock had to be excavated. Steel reinforcements had to be anchored. Drainage systems had to be installed. All before the first stone wall could rise, George had hired over 300 workers at the project's peak. Stonemasons earned premium wages, $4 daily when typical labourers made less than $2. Master craftsmen commanded even more. The weekly payroll exceeded $10,000, just for labour. Material costs dwarfed everything else. The castle's outer walls used limestone quarried in Massachusetts and transported hundreds of miles. Each block had to be cut, shaped, numbered, shipped, and placed according to precise architectural plans. Thousands of tons of stone moved through this process. Inside, the specifications grew more demanding. Louise wanted oak panelling throughout the main floors. Not ordinary oak, hand-selected timber milled to exacting standards. George purchased entire forests to ensure uniform grain patterns. Craftsmen spent months carving decorative elements into panels before installation. The grand staircase became an obsession within the obsession. George commissioned it from John D. Wareham, a master woodcarver known for ecclesiastical work. Wareham spent 2 years creating the staircase, each baluster hand-turned, each newel post hand-carved with botanical motifs. The finished piece was sculpture disguised as architecture. It cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. The ballroom ceiling featured hand-painted murals depicting Renaissance scenes. George hired artists who had worked on European cathedrals. They lay on scaffolding for months, painting clouds and angels and mythological figures. Louise wanted beauty overhead. George delivered transcendence. Bathrooms received the same obsessive attention. Each of the castle's 11 full bathrooms featured custom tile work, hand-painted sinks, ornate bronze fixtures. The master bathroom alone cost more than a comfortable middle-class house. George installed central heating, a massive undertaking in 1900. Coal-fired boilers in the basement fed radiators throughout the building. Pipes ran through walls and floors in complex networks. The system required its own operator to maintain. Electricity demanded similar infrastructure. The powerhouse on neighbouring Wellesley Island contained state-of-the-art generators. Underground cables carried current beneath the river to Hart Island. The castle would glow with electric light when most of America still burned kerosene. Louise wanted indoor plumbing throughout. George built a water system that would serve a small town. Pumps drew water from the river. Filtration systems made it drinkable. Pressure tanks ensured consistent flow. Sewage systems carried waste away. The invisible infrastructure cost hundreds of thousands. The grounds required equally extravagant resources. Landscape transformation consumed entire seasons. Workers removed native vegetation. They blasted rock. They built retaining walls. Barges delivered thousands of tons of topsoil. More barges brought mature trees, fully grown specimens that cost fortunes to transplant. Garden design followed formal European principles. Stone pathways were laid in intricate patterns. Fountains were installed at carefully chosen sightlines. Rose gardens were planted with rare varietals. Every vista was composed like a painting. George commissioned a separate building just to house gardening equipment and staff. The structure cost more than most estate homes. But Louise loved gardens, so George built her the means to maintain paradise. The yacht house on neighbouring Wellesley Island became its own architectural marvel. 3 stories tall with elaborate stonework and a red tile roof, it could house multiple vessels in water-level bays while providing guest quarters above. It cost over $100,000 for a boathouse. George built a stone bridge connecting the yacht house island to another property. He constructed docks with custom stonework. He even built a tower, a miniature castle, just as a playful architectural accent. Every element served Louise's vision, or George's vision of Louise's vision. The line between them had blurred. Friends noticed George's increasing fixation. He talked about the castle constantly. He reviewed plans obsessively. He travelled to the island multiple times per week during construction seasons, often staying overnight in the workers' village to supervise morning progress. His hotel still ran efficiently. Louise and trusted managers handled daily operations. But George's heart was on Hart Island. Some called it romantic, others called it concerning. The financial commitment grew beyond even George's immense wealth. The initial $2.5 million budget proved laughably inadequate. By 1903, George had spent over $4 million, closer to $130 million in today's money. He showed no sign of stopping. The castle became his masterwork, his legacy, his proof that an immigrant kitchen boy could build something that would outlast empires. He wasn't just constructing walls, he was defying mortality, but mortality doesn't negotiate. Louise's health continued its quiet decline. She tired more easily, headaches plagued her, her appetite diminished. Doctors offered vague diagnoses, stress perhaps, or age. She was only 41, but medical understanding in 1904 was primitive. George noticed everything. The way she paused on stairs, the way colour would suddenly drain from her face, the way she gripped chair arms when standing. He responded by accelerating construction. If the castle could just be finished, she would rest. She would recover. The fresh river air and beautiful surroundings would restore her. George convinced himself the castle wasn't just a gift. It was medicine. Workers felt the increased pressure. George demanded faster progress. He paid bonuses for early completion. He brought in additional craftsmen. The island buzzed with urgent activity. Christmas 1903 approached. The castle stood nearly complete. Exterior work was finished. Most interior rooms were done. Only final details remained: furniture placement, minor touch-ups, landscape finishing work waiting for spring. Louise spent the holiday season in New York. The Waldorf Astoria prepared for its grandest New Year celebration yet. Louise, ever the perfectionist, supervised arrangements despite her fatigue. George watched her with growing worry. But Louise insisted she was fine, just tired, just busy. The castle would be ready soon, and then she could rest. January arrived cold and grey. Louise attended to her usual duties. She reviewed hotel operations. She corresponded with craftsmen about final castle details. She planned the Valentine's Day unveiling. Everything was proceeding according to plan. George allowed himself to believe the worst had passed. The castle was nearly complete. Louise seemed stable. Spring would bring the culmination of 5 years of dreaming and building and perfecting. He couldn't have been more wrong. January 7th, 1904. Louise Boldt woke with pressure in her chest. She said nothing. Louise rarely complained. She'd spent decades managing hotels, raising children, supporting George's ambitions. Discomfort was something you endured privately. So she rose, she dressed, she moved through her morning routine. The pressure intensified. By afternoon, Louise could no longer hide her distress. George summoned doctors immediately. They arrived to find Louise pale, sweating, struggling to breathe. The diagnosis came swiftly: acute heart failure. Medical science in 1904 offered little. No cardiac surgery, no life-saving drugs, no emergency interventions. Doctors could only make Louise comfortable and hope. George refused to accept this. He brought in more specialists. The best doctors in New York gathered around Louise's bedside. They conferred in hushed tones. They administered what treatments existed: digitalis, rest, prayers. Nothing worked. Louise's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her heart, weakened by causes doctors couldn't fully understand, was failing. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Breathing became laboured. Her skin took on a waxy pallor. George sat beside her bed, holding her hand. This wasn't possible. Louise was only 41. They had decades ahead. The castle was nearly finished. They were supposed to grow old together on Hart Island, surrounded by grandchildren and gardens and the life they'd built. But life doesn't honour plans. On January 8th, 1904, Louise Augusta Boldt died. George was beside her. He watched the woman he'd loved for 27 years take her last breath. The woman who'd been his partner, his advisor, his reason for everything. Gone. The castle, barely a week from completion, suddenly meant nothing. George's grief manifested as paralysis. He didn't rage. He didn't weep publicly. He simply stopped. Friends found him sitting in silence, staring at nothing. His children tried to comfort him. He barely responded. The funeral was held at Grace Church in New York. Society figures filled the pews: Astors, Vanderbilts, the entire elite stratum of Gilded Age America. They came to mourn Louise and support George, but George was already gone. After the service, after Louise was laid to rest, George made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He sent a single telegram to Hart Island. 3 words: stop all work. Workers on the island received the message and froze. Stop? But the castle was nearly finished. A few more weeks would complete everything. Spring would bring the planned unveiling. Surely George meant pause, not stop. But George meant stop. He sent no further instructions, no plans for resumption, no timeline for completion, just silence. Workers waited days for clarification. None came. Gradually they packed their tools and departed. Craftsmen returned to other projects. Suppliers stopped shipments. The island grew quiet. The castle stood frozen mid-dream. Furniture never arrived. Gardens remained half-planted. Paint dried in cans. Tools lay where workers dropped them. The building wasn't ruined. It was abandoned. A monument left incomplete at the precise moment joy transformed into grief. George never returned to Hart Island. Not once. Not ever. The place built entirely for Louise couldn't exist without her. He couldn't walk those halls designed for her footsteps. He couldn't see gardens meant for her enjoyment. The castle was supposed to be their shared dream. Without Louise, it was just expensive stone. Friends tried to convince George to finish the project. His children suggested completing it as a memorial. Business associates argued about the wasted investment. George ignored them all. What would completion prove? That money could buy anything? That George could persist through grief? None of that mattered. The castle's purpose had died with Louise. The public reaction was swift and conflicted. Some called George's decision romantic, a grand gesture of grief worthy of poetry. Others called it wasteful, millions of dollars abandoned because one person died. Society columnists debated whether George's response honoured Louise or insulted her memory. George didn't care about public opinion. He retreated into his work. The Waldorf Astoria demanded his attention. He still had responsibilities, still had employees depending on him, still had a life to somehow continue living. But the passion was gone. George went through motions that had once brought him joy. The years following Louise's death revealed a man fundamentally altered. George maintained his business empire. He remained socially active. He fulfilled his obligations. But those who knew him well saw the change. The warmth had vanished. The obsessive attention to detail that had built the Waldorf Astoria and Boldt Castle now seemed mechanical. He aged rapidly. Photographs from 1905 show a man who looks decades older than his 54 years. His eyes held something hollow. Friends described him as present but absent, his body in rooms while his mind remained elsewhere. Back on Hart Island, nature began reclaiming the castle. Without maintenance, the building deteriorated. Windows broke in storms, roof sections leaked, water seeped into walls, freeze-thaw cycles cracked stonework, vegetation pushed through pavement, the magnificent gardens became overgrown tangles. Vandals arrived next. Locals and tourists discovered the abandoned castle and stripped it for souvenirs. Decorative elements disappeared. Copper was torn from walls, woodwork was pried loose, anything portable was stolen. The castle became a corpse being picked clean. George never intervened. He never visited. He never sent maintenance crews. He simply let it happen. If someone had asked why, he likely wouldn't have answered. What words could explain? The castle represented everything George had loved and lost. Completing it would memorialise Louise, yes, but it would also finalise her absence. As long as the castle remained unfinished, some part of George could pretend the dream might still come true. Psychology wasn't George's concern. He was a hotel magnate, not a philosopher, but his choice revealed profound emotional truth. Grief isn't logical. Loss doesn't follow plans. Sometimes the only response to unbearable pain is to walk away. So, George walked away. His children adapted to their father's silence. His friends learned not to mention the castle. His employees avoided the topic entirely. Hart Island became the family's unspoken tragedy. The place where joy had died alongside Louise. Years passed. George remained successful in business. He maintained his hotels with the efficiency Louise had taught him. He attended social functions. He aged. But part of him never left January 1904. Part of him would always be sitting beside Louise's bed, watching her breathe, counting the moments before everything changed. The castle was built on hope. Its abandonment was built on hopelessness. George lived 17 more years after Louise's death. 17 years of going through motions. 17 years of success without joy. 17 years of wealth without purpose. He never remarried, never loved again, never built again. On December 5th, 1916, George Boldt died of heart disease, the same condition that killed Louise. For 7 decades, Boldt Castle stood abandoned. The building that had consumed millions of dollars and years of labour became a haunting presence in the 1,000 Islands. Locals knew the story. Everyone did. The millionaire who built a castle for his wife and abandoned it when she died. Romance or madness, depending on who told the tale. The castle itself deteriorated into picturesque ruin. By the 1920s, it resembled something from a Gothic novel. Walls stood intact but empty. Windows gaped like missing teeth. Vegetation claimed the interior, trees growing through floors, vines covering walls. The grand staircase rotted. Murals peeled. Marble cracked from freeze-thaw cycles. The building was dying slowly. Tourists began arriving by boat to explore the ruins. They wandered through empty rooms, imagining the grandeur that might have been. They took photographs of decay, collapsed ceilings, broken fixtures, nature consuming human ambition. The castle became a destination precisely because it was unfinished. Something about abandonment fascinated people. Perhaps it was the waste. $4,1904 left to crumble. Perhaps it was the romance. A man so devastated by loss he couldn't complete his masterwork. Perhaps it was the mystery. What would the castle have looked like finished? What parties might have filled these rooms? What life might have bloomed here? But mostly, people came because Boldt Castle embodied a universal truth. Nothing lasts. Not wealth, not love, not even stone. George Boldt had built something meant to endure forever. Instead, he created a monument to impermanence. Every crumbling wall whispered the same message: all dreams end. The Boldt family retained ownership through George's children, but they showed little interest in the property. Clover and George Jr. had their own lives, their own griefs. The castle represented their mother's death and their father's dissolution. Why would they return? Vandalism accelerated through the mid-20th century. The castle became a target for treasure hunters and souvenir seekers. Anything of value was stripped and sold. Windows were systematically broken. Walls were defaced with graffiti. The building transformed from romantic ruin to dangerous derelict. By the 1960s, local authorities debated demolition. The castle was a safety hazard. Kids broke in constantly. Injuries occurred. Insurance was impossible. The structure was beyond repair. Tear it down, many argued. End the eyesore. But something stayed their hand. Maybe it was the story. Maybe it was the stubborn beauty that persisted through decay. Maybe it was reluctance to erase such a visible piece of history. For whatever reason, the castle survived into the 1970s. Then something unexpected happened. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority acquired the property in 1977. Their goal wasn't preservation, it was liability management. But public response surprised them. Locals advocated for restoration. Tourism boards recognized potential. Historians documented the architecture. Suddenly, people cared about saving Boldt Castle. Not because it was beautiful, because it was honest. Restoration began slowly in the 1980s. The work wasn't about recreating George's vision. That was impossible. Too much had been destroyed. Too much knowledge was lost. Instead, restoration focused on stabilization and interpretation. Workers rebuilt roofs to stop water damage. They reinforced walls to prevent collapse. They cleared vegetation and restored basic infrastructure. But they left the buildings in completion visible. You could walk through finished rooms with carved woodwork and painted ceilings, then enter empty spaces showing bare stone and exposed beams. The contrast became the point. Visitors could experience both George's dream and his abandonment simultaneously. They could see the castle's potential and its tragedy in the same view. Finished rooms showed what might have been. Unfinished spaces showed what was lost. The restoration transformed Boldt Castle into something George never intended. A successful monument to failure. Tens of thousands of tourists visit annually now. They pay admission fees that fund ongoing restoration. They wander through rooms imagining Louise and George. They stand on balconies overlooking the river and contemplate the nature of love and loss. The castle that George abandoned became more famous than it ever would have been if he'd finished it. Because the story matters more than the building. Finished, Boldt Castle would have been just another Gilded Age mansion. Impressive but not unique. Abandoned, it became a symbol, a meditation on grief's power to halt human ambition, a reminder that emotional truth outweighs architectural perfection. George built the castle for Louise, but abandoning it became his truest expression of love. Completion would have been a lie. It would have suggested George could move forward, could finish what they'd started together, could somehow continue without her. Abandonment was honest. It said, this dream required Louise. Without her, there is no dream. The philosophical implications ripple outward. What defines a building's purpose? Is it the architect's intention, the owner's desire, the final use? Boldt Castle failed at every intended purpose. It never housed the Boldts. It never hosted grand parties. It never became the summer palace George envisioned. Yet it succeeded at something deeper. It became a place where people confront mortality and meaning, where tourists contemplate what matters in their own lives, where grief becomes visible and almost holy. The castle serves a purpose George never imagined but desperately needed. It keeps Louise present. Every visitor who learns her story remembers Louise Boldt existed. Every article about the castle mentions her name. Every tour guide recounts her love of European architecture and her partnership with George. The castle didn't give Louise the home she wanted, but it gave her immortality. George died not knowing this. He died believing he'd failed Louise by abandoning their dream. He died thinking the castle represented his inability to continue after her loss. He was wrong. The castle represented exactly what Louise meant to him. She wasn't replaceable. She wasn't someone you mourned and moved past. She was essential, the foundation. Without her, nothing else made sense. George's business success after 1904 proved he could function. His continued management of the Waldorf Astoria showed he could perform. But Hart Island revealed his emotional truth. Some losses can't be overcome. Sometimes grief wins, sometimes you abandon the dream, and sometimes that's the right choice. Modern visitors often leave Boldt Castle with unexpected emotions. They arrive expecting romantic tragedy. They leave contemplating their own priorities. The castle asks uncomfortable questions. What are you building? Why are you building it? Who are you building it for? What happens if they're gone? George spent 5 years and millions of dollars creating something that existed for only one purpose. When that purpose died, the building lost all meaning. This seems like failure, but perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps it's rare integrity. How many people build monuments to ego disguised as love? How many projects continue past their purpose through momentum or pride? George could have finished the castle. He could have opened it to the public. He could have turned Louise's dream into his memorial. He chose truth instead. The unfinished state declares, this was never about the building. It was always about Louise. Without her, stones are just stones. Rooms are just empty space. Beauty without purpose is just expensive decoration. George abandoned perfection in favor of honesty. He left the castle as evidence of what love actually costs. Not money, not labor, not even grief. The real cost is meaning itself. Current restoration efforts embrace this interpretation. Workers stabilize the castle but don't complete it. They preserve the unfinished quality that makes the building significant. Future visitors will see the same contrasts: finished rooms beside empty shells, completed visions beside abandoned dreams. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority now views Boldt Castle as their most valuable property. Not financially, though tourism revenue is substantial. Valuable because the castle teaches something museums can't, that failure and beauty coexist, that incompletion can be more profound than perfection, that love's truest monument isn't triumph but honest grief. Louise and George Boldt left no direct descendants who continued the family legacy. Their children are long dead. The Waldorf Astoria has been rebuilt and rebranded. George's hotel empire exists only in history books, but the castle remains, incomplete, abandoned, perfect. Because it tells a truth we need to hear. The deepest love doesn't conquer or endure or overcome. Sometimes it just stops. It stands frozen at the moment of loss, refusing to pretend life can continue unchanged. George Boldt built many things in his life: hotels, businesses, wealth, legacy. But only one thing he built was completely honest: the castle he couldn't finish. That's the monument that matters, not to wealth or ambition or Gilded Age excess, but to love that ran so deep that when it ended, everything ended with it. Hart Island sits in the St. Lawrence River still. Trees grow around the castle, boats pass by, tourists arrive. The building stands against time, not defying it, but embodying it, showing what love and loss look like when translated into stone and abandonment and imperfect memory. George built Louise a castle. Then Louise died. Then George did the only thing that made sense. He walked away. And in walking away, he created something far more valuable than the finished palace he'd envisioned. He created honest grief made visible, a place where loss becomes architecture, where emptiness has shape and weight and terrible beauty. Boldt Castle isn't a failure. It's the only thing George built that truly succeeded at expressing what mattered most. Love ended here, and that ending, that honest, awful, irreversible ending, is the story that needed to be told. Boldt Castle stands because George Boldt couldn't. His abandonment created something more powerful than completion ever could, a space where we confront what we're building and why, where we remember that behind every grand structure lives human emotion, love, ambition, grief, loss. What other forgotten estates hold stories that change the people who built them? What other abandoned dreams deserve to be understood rather than just photographed? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which historical properties you'd like to see explored, and if this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more untold histories waiting to be discovered, each one revealing something true about what it means to build, to love, and to lose. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones left unfinished.